Well, good morning or afternoon. It's the top of the hour. Thank you all for tuning in and Shana Tova to all those celebrating Rosh Hashanah this week. My name is Stephen Costio, and I'm excited to welcome you to the Blending and Braiding webinar series from the U.S. Department of Education. We're thrilled to co host this series with the White House, bringing in experts across federal, state, and local agencies, as well as local and community leaders from nonprofits, universities, and philanthropy. Today's webinar will focus on how to blend and braid federal, state, and local funds to provide easily accessible services to students and families. We'll spend most of our time in a moderated discussion with experts across the country and are lucky to be joined by education leaders from the White House and Department of Education to provide opening and closing remarks. As with all webinars in this series, this webinar will be recorded. While we will not have specific time for audience questions today, we encourage you to share your questions using the Zoom chat, and we will be monitoring that during today's webinar and use your questions to inform our future sessions. We've organized the series of webinars around the following objectives on this slide. These boil down to increasing awareness and understanding of how essential services from federal, state, and local governments can be accessed more easily by students and families, identifying and highlighting examples of blending and braiding cradle to career supports, demonstrating how community-driven approaches for schools can support increased access to services, and identifying how federal funds can be used to sustain whole child investments that started with American Rescue Plan Act funds. Throughout this series, you will also hear about several funding streams, not just within the U.S. Department of Education, but also spanning across agencies. For example, many schools use funding from the Department of Health and Human Services to provide school-based healthcare, from the Department of Justice to support mentoring programs, and AmeriCorps funding to support tutoring and enrichment. There's also funding from the Department of Agriculture, which supports school nutrition. Since this series focuses on blending and braiding, we wanted to start with some short definitions of what these terms mean. When we say blending, we mean combining funds from multiple sources into a single pot for a common purpose or initiative. When funds are blended, they lose their individual identity, and this means that the blended pot of funds has its own reporting requirements. When we say braiding, we mean coordinating funds from different sources for one purpose or initiative. Braided funding sources keep their specific identity. This means that each of the funding streams maintains their own reporting requirements, and this is more common and will be the main focus of our discussion today. To help us better understand the purpose of this series, I'm delighted to turn it over to someone who has helped shape my understanding of these topics of education policy and has helped craft policies from the schoolhouse to the White House, from the Domestic Policy Council, Jessica Cardashon.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. It is a pleasure to be here today with you all. And thank you, Stephen, for putting this together. I'm really excited for the lineup of experts that you have ahead to talk about an issue that we get asked about a lot frequently, which is you keep telling us to blend and braid, but what is it and how do we actually do it? And this process is always an important one, but it is particularly important as we know that schools are planning for the wind down of American Rescue Plan funds. The administration is extremely proud that we were able to secure $130 billion through the American Rescue Plan, the largest investment ever in K-12 education to address the impact of COVID. But we know that this was temporary funding, and that more funds are needed from different sources to address the pre-existing inequities that we often see in K-12 education that existed before COVID, as schools kind of rethink their resources. We also know that there were many new investments that were made through ARP dollars, such as expanding the number of full-service community schools, making sure more students have access to after school programs, summer learning programs, bringing in additional supports. And we don't want to see those services and supports go away. We applaud the number of states that have already stepped up to increase their investment in public education. To sustain these investments, we hope that more states will also follow in their lead. But we also know that federal funding is critically important, and we need to make sure that schools can access federal, state, local funding, funding from philanthropy and nonprofit organizations to sustain and build on these efforts. But wanted to share a little bit about what the administration has done on our end. For example, one of the things that we have done, which we think is kind of the most simplest form of blending and braiding, is made it easier to use Medicaid for school-based services. 25 states in total now use Medicaid to cover school-based health services. And we hope that the remaining 25 states will step up as well and make it easier for students to access these services at their school. We also issued a toolkit on how to support the different components of full service community schools, leveraging federal funds from across HHS to labor to transportation to the Department of Education. We've also worked really hard, our Department of Agriculture, to make it easier for students to access universal school meals, but really excited that 8 states have made it easier by providing universal school meals. So that leaves 42 left to do that. These states are California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Vermont. California has also prioritized and invested in local food and farm to school partnerships. So we have lots of wonderful examples of states that are really stepping up as well on their part. And we know that you'll hear more across the 5-part webinar series. And the last thing that I'll say is, making sure that students and families and schools have the resources that they need and that they're easy to identify and easy to access is also of particular importance in light of the administration's focus on addressing chronic absenteeism, which we know in many communities it's a challenge that they faced prior to COVID that's only gotten worse. In other communities, it's not a challenge that they previously had to address. And what we are consistently hearing that for a large number of students, the barrier to regular school attendance and engagement is around housing, transportation, mental health, and other health services. And so being able for schools and families to more easily tap into these different resources is even more important, even more critically important at this stage. So really excited for the speakers ahead and for the department's leadership in pulling this all together. So Stephen, with that, I will hand it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica. And I saw we already have a question in the chat that I think your document answers of that White House toolkit for community schools has a list of so many great funding sources across agencies that can support, coordinators that can support integrated student supports, family engagement, those other components of community schools. So, so glad that you shared that with this team. And I'm really excited now to bring up our set of speakers who are experts across the country in the topics on the topics of blending and braiding. And specifically, this main event, I want to welcome to the webinar Abe Fernandez, the director of the National Center for Community Schools, Dreama Gentry, the president and CEO of Partners for Rural Impact, Oprah Keys, who's the director of the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, Kim McWilliams, the chief officer of Family, School, and Community Partnerships at the Evansville Vanderburgh School Corporation in Indiana, and Ashley Harris, the founder and strategist at Jumping Hoops Consulting. So excited to have you all here. And with that, I'll kick it over to you, Abe.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that introduction and for getting this webinar series and today's kickoff session pulled together. Really appreciate your leadership. Abe Fernandez, I have the great privilege of leading the National Center for Community Schools, which is based in New York City out of Children's Aid. We're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year of providing technical assistance and capacity building support to community school initiatives all over the country and even beyond. And I can tell you that throughout our 30-year history, sustainability is one of those evergreen topics that always comes up, whether you are new to the strategy or quite established. That said, I think it's fair to say that there has been an even greater interest on sustainability and funding in recent months, maybe for at least a couple of reasons. First, I hope everyone who has joined today and doing community schools work is aware of the essentials framework for community schools transformation. This is a relatively new framework that we developed with generous support from the Balmer Group and in partnership with our colleagues at the Brookings Institution, the Coalition for Community Schools, and the Learning Policy Institute, and scores of practitioners and leaders all across the country through an effort called Community Schools Forward. I won't talk about that framework today, although I do that often, but I will just highlight that the outer ring of the framework identifies the supportive infrastructure needed at the systems level for community schools to thrive. And needless to say, sustainable resources is one of those key elements. So I think that's one thing that we've noticed there's a lot of interest around. Secondly, there's been a significant amount of anxiety about how, in particular, how to navigate the ESSER funding cliff, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. And I'm sure that this is something that just about everyone joining us today is very aware of, very familiar with. So we, as a capacity building organization, we've been doing a lot of work recently in helping folks to think through this challenge. And we recently facilitated a webinar series on sustainability. This series was anchored by a framework developed by the Finance Project many years ago, as well as anchored by some very important lessons that we've learned about how to approach funding community schools at scale and for the long term. So yes, the focus of the conversation was on sustainability, which we define as a process of strategic thinking and effective action designed to secure the range of resources needed to achieve specific results. But just as far as framing the conversation we're going to have today, I wanted to clarify a couple of ideas that we've been talking about through the series and really in the last several months. First, sustainability is not only about funding. In fact, what we've learned is that what seems to have the most impact on the long-term health and sustainability of the strategy are things like having a shared vision, and having a results framework, being clear about what it is that you're trying to sustain. It's also important to have broad community support and engagement in the life and the governance of the community school. And I think you're going to hear examples from the panel today about how partnerships and processes like assets and needs assessments really help to set the stage for sustainability to take place. Second, the finance project framework calls out the need for strategic financing. Now that means in part recognizing that community schools and promised neighborhoods can add both human and financial resources to schools. But it also means that there has to be some attention paid to blending and braiding funding. And so on the funding front of this conversation, we have seen how both education and non-education dollars from multiple sources can and should be leveraged to add value to the work of schools, in schools, and in neighborhoods. In fact, we often cite former U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, who, when he reflected on his time as the CEO of schools in Chicago, he talked about community schools being the most highly leveraged dollars that he spent as a superintendent, citing that for every dollar he invested in community schools, he was able to get $4, $5, $6, $7 back in support from community partners and other government sources. And so this idea of blending and braiding ends up being a really key part of how to do community schools in promised neighborhoods. And so we're really excited to have an opportunity to have an amazing group of folks to share a little bit of their experience with this strategy. And so I will get out of the way and start the conversation. So we're going to start with with Dreama Gentry, who I think you heard is the president and CEO of Partners for Rural Impact. So, Dreama, let's start with you. And first, I'm going to ask if you want to add anything to the definition that you saw of blending and braiding. Please feel free to do that. But really curious if you could start us off sharing a little bit about how Partners for Rural Impact has utilized blending and braiding as you have scaled up, which you've done pretty significantly in recent years.
Yeah, thanks, Abe. And I do think that doing the blending and braiding now is so much easier, in part because the way that the department has pulled together so many resources, and we've gotten a lot more sophisticated. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and 30 years ago, people got a little tense if you started thinking about braiding and blending dollars, particularly federal dollars. And so most of our work is really around braiding the dollars together from different federal agencies, and also thinking about private dollars. We work primarily in rural America, so often it is those federal dollars are the primary resource. And I think what we've learned through the years is the braiding of the dollars can actually help you surpass the outcomes that you envision when you design a promised neighborhood or a community school, but it can also actually help sustain the work. Our first promised neighborhood, we were the first rural promised neighborhood, 2010, 2011. That work is still continuing in that community because we've found other resources to come in and continue to fund the essential elements of what we found was needed during the promised neighborhood. And you nailed it, Abe, when you talked about you have to have the shared vision and the shared framework, because that's critical. So anytime we start thinking about designing a federal project, whether it's a community school or a promised neighborhood, we first think about what are the outcomes we want to see for all kids. And those outcomes actually then are the sort of the center of when we start thinking about which funds to bring in. So for example, third grade reading. If we're really looking at moving third grade reading, we think about what do we have to do, what can we do here, but then also what are the other federal programs, state programs that support third grade reading. And when you think about moving third grade reading, you got to think about moving K readiness too, right? Because you're working down that pipeline. You have to think about out of school, 21st century grants. You have to think about innovative approaches to literacy. And then I think Jessica did a great job of framing, you have to think about cross-sector. How do we ensure that there's housing stability? And that's why I think our community schools as a component, if you have a community school and a site coordinator who's actually providing the infrastructure to think through how do we move a specific outcome, who are the partners at the table, that's the essential element we've found, is having that person. And that's really the heart of our backbone, our framework in the schools. I do think there's another piece here around the strong partnerships, is that you have to be willing to allow someone else to bring the money in, or you have to be willing to sit around the table and say, okay, we would all love to be the one holding this grant or this project or this funding stream, but it'll actually be more sustainable if this partner over here does it. And then you have to also be willing to share funding among partners, because sometimes the person that can bring the funding in doesn't want to or doesn't have the capacity to actually do it. So having those frameworks and systems for sharing the funding. So I think what we found through the years in rural places is the shared vision, it's the defined outcomes, and knowing what works cradle to career that's data and evidence-based and what needs to be funded, and then really being transparent and allowing the sharing of funds and all the partners to lean in.
Yeah, really appreciate that. And I love that you talked about centering the outcomes as being a way to kind of get the resources to be driven by the results that we want. What a powerful example that is, the role of the coordinator in bringing folks together. And of course, the importance of partnerships. On that partnership part of this, I'm curious if you can say a little bit about the work you've done to build the capacity of partners to be able to blend and braid. I don't think people are there automatically. It does require some capacity building. So can you share a little bit about that?
And I think the first piece of the capacity building is getting all the partners, whether you're the health partner or the economic development partner or the education partners, to think about why that shared outcome of third grade reading is critically important. So it's getting partners to adopt the outcome and say, we want all children in our place to meet and achieve this outcome. Then there's the trust piece. I do think that a lot of our communities have been burned by programs coming in to do a grant for 5 years. And then when that 5 years is over, okay, that was great, but now the partners disappear. So it is the trust with community and ensuring that the partners around the table are partners that are in it the long haul for the community. And then there's the technical piece of, if you have a partner that is an LEA that has never applied for a federal grant before, how do you help them actually go online and start to learn about it and become grant ready? How do you get your faith-based organization that's been doing great after school and summer work, actually get them ready to do federal grants too, and other types of state funding? So the capacity building goes all the way from trust to sort of understanding the power of long-term commitment to community, to actual technical skills of the partners.
And I would imagine there's even some trust building with the partners.
Oh, yeah.
There's this term that we learned many years ago that kind of describes the tension of wanting to collaborate with partners and also competing with them for funding. And that term is co-opetition, right? So there is that tension there. And so how do you address that sort of building the trust so that you can get more together? But it does take some work to get there. How do you do that?
I think you start small, and you start small on one project, and you actually follow through, and you actually do share dollars, and you share responsibilities, and you share power. And once folks realize that you're really in it, and I think it's also the same thing, once the other partners realize that you care about the community and the residents. So it is a long-term piece. You can't expect it to happen immediately, and I don't think there's any training that would get you to that point, but it's getting to know each other and trusting. And it's also not partnering with folks who might have money but are not connected to community. So part of the way we build trust is not inviting some folks to the table if we don't think they really, even though they could bring resources, if they're not bought into the long term, then they're not at the leadership table. They might be engaged, but they're not at the table.
So true. So true. Thank you so much, Dreama. We're gonna go from Kentucky and head a little bit northeast to Baltimore. And let's bring Oprah into this conversation. So Oprah Keys is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Center for Restorative Change at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work. So glad you're here, Oprah. Where you bring a different perspective to this, given that you work at a university. And so curious to hear a little bit about, first of all, if you have another way of thinking about blending and braiding, please, let's start there. But if you can talk about both the advantages and the disadvantages of working at a university to move this idea of blending and braiding funds forward as you think about your cradle to career initiatives in your neck of the woods.
Well, thank y'all for having me. I'll start off with just how we've been able to blend and more so braid funding, I would say, as a university partner. So we're housed in Baltimore, as you mentioned, and we have been fortunate to work in our communities for a long period of time. We have a wide range of folks, whether it's our community school coordinators, shout out to them, our community health workers, clinicians, that are really boots on the ground, as you would say. And through those relationships that they've been able to build in the communities that we work with, we get consistent feedback on what's working, what the assets are, what the needs are, and where those missing puzzle pieces are. So with that information, along with our more formal processes that we're able to do as an organization that's been a lead agency for community schools for well over 15 years, we're able to leverage those different opportunities to really identify those key focus areas within being housed in a school of social work. So whether that's socially engineered trauma for us in Baltimore, whether that's youth experiencing grief, whether it's the data that came out that there is racial disproportionality in folks who are able to pass the social work licensing exam and how that impacts students, we've been able to look at those pieces and then look at the funding landscape, particularly federal in the last couple of years, but also state and local, and say, okay, how can we make these pieces fit? So We were fortunate to start out as a Promise Neighborhood site, and we were able to leverage the work that we do, the relationships that we've built, the partnerships that we already had, um, and the lessons that we learned to pivot really well into full service community schools. So that was one way through the U.S. Department of Education that we were able to braid funding. Something else that came up, as I mentioned, was school social work. So we train the next generation of social workers. So we're seeing this social work disparity for diverse social workers. We're seeing that our students in school don't have enough school-based mental health supports. So when the U.S. Department of Education released the Mental Health Service Professional Demonstration Program grant, that felt like a natural fit for us. And through that, we were able to partner with 2 bachelor's of social work programs and create a pipeline, which ultimately leads to a fellowship where we'll have over 100 diverse school-based mental health professionals over the next 5 years. But also in the short term, we have more social work interns in those schools that can provide mental health services, which we know supports chronic absenteeism, academic outcomes, and overall well-being. We were also able to switch over to the U.S. Department of Justice. I mentioned earlier, socially engineered trauma and grief and violence is a major concern for us in Baltimore. So the U.S. Department of Justice and their Enhancing School Capacity to Mitigate Youth Violence program was also a natural fit for us to work in 2 of our elementary and middle schools to mitigate youth violence, which again supports chronic absenteeism, academic outcomes, and overall well-being. So that on a federal level has been really impactful for us in terms of braiding. Then we also have our state funding. We have our Maryland blueprint. We have our blueprint for Maryland's future,
Mhm.
which has been crucial in our community school work. And then we've also had other opportunities through the Maryland State Department of Education, Maryland Family Network, to open a family support center, which allows us to help our youngest neighbors and their caregivers as we think about entering schools. So a lot of creativity, a
Yeah.
lot of partnership, a lot of listening and learning and then applying. I would say that there's a lot of advantages to being a university partner. To your second question,
Mhm.
one, we have that institutional credibility as showing up as the University of Maryland. We have that infrastructure as it relates to finance, whether that's the pre-award team, the post-award team, the accountants. We have our history and expertise in data and evaluation, grant administration, partnerships, and having those existing agreements with a wide range of partners, and particularly our local school districts. But I think it also comes with some challenges. The first one, and Dreama mentioned it earlier as well, is that acknowledging that history of institutional harm in the communities that we're working with. And that is a barrier. And that is something that we have to be very intentional about in how we move forward. We also have challenges around, I would say, bureaucratic holdups and how long it can
Mhm.
sometimes take to get something done. Um, and I would say that a current challenge, and rightfully so, is that university partners and other large institutions are really being charged with supporting from behind rather than leading up front. And what does it look like to really engage our community members and community partners in a way that we're mindful of that power dynamic and where we really um, have the folks with the lived experience and those that are directly impacted by the work that's happening lead the work. And we have that institutional backing where, like, we're really good at our key things.
Mm.
Other community-based organizations and community members are really good in their area of expertise, and we just allow everybody to operate in that space.
Yeah, what great examples of different streams of funding, federal, state, it looks like local as well, probably. And I think you're right. Like there are some real advantages to being a university partner, but it's also important to recognize the history of of the relationship you've had and that there might be some limitations. One thing Dreama said that we talked about with Dreama was about building the capacity of folks to do some of this work. And I think you've also been thinking about whether it needs to be the university leading
Mhm.
this. And so can you say a little bit about how you've been able to build the capacity of your partners to bring some of this conversation to them?
Yeah, I think that's been a key part of this whole conversation, particularly as it relates to sustainability. And how are we as universities and other large institutions um, willing to leverage our budgets, less so for salaries and service delivery, and more so into that capacity building space. How are we working with folks to support them, whether that is helping them write a grant or even making them aware of an opportunity? How are we able to support with some of the data and evaluation? Have y'all thought about this kind of dashboard to track these kind of data metrics? I would say that that is a still an area of growth for
Mhm.
us. I think we've made some great steps. I wouldn't say we're all the way there yet,
Sure.
but I think we have been fortunate in getting that consistent feedback, whether directly to us or with our external evaluator, the Urban Institute, to get that further feedback of this is where I think the university would be most helpful in supporting us as a community member or community partner, and us being responsive to that and changing how we operate so that we can support that in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I love that. And I really appreciate that you brought up this idea of leveraging data. So I want to ask you about, a little bit more about that. How have you thought about the data you're collecting and reporting on, both in terms of, I'm sure, needs and assets, but also around impact? How has that helped you? How has that bolstered the work you're doing around blending and braiding funds?
I think it allows us to really look at what, like, again, what our sphere of excellence is, right? Where are we
Mhm.
moving the needle in a meaningful way and where are we not? And the areas that we're not, those may not be the areas where we need to pursue more funding. That's more so where we maybe need to partner with somebody else and encourage them to apply for funding so we can build skills in that area and enhance things that are going well. And it allows us to kind of redirect our focus to those areas where collectively we are making a great impact, and then thinking with our partners, how can we enhance this in a meaningful way, and what could progress look like within the parameters of this funding structure or this time period.
Excellent, excellent. And I think one thing that is important to highlight here is that there's lots of data being collected. It's not always being used in the ways that are helpful in terms of implementation. We also want to center that in this conversation around sustainability as well. And you guys are doing some good work around that. So thank you for sharing that example.
Thank you.
Um, Great. So let's shift over to let's go mid to the Midwest and let's bring Kim into this conversation. So we've heard from a nonprofit based in the South. We got the perspective of a university in Baltimore. Let's hear from the perspective of a school district. And so Kim McWilliams is the Chief Officer of Family, School, and Community Partnerships at Evansville Vanderburgh School Corporation in Evansville, Indiana. Kim, thank you for joining us. One thing that, and I've had the privilege of spending some time in Evansville. It's been a little while, but I know even then it was one major theme of the work there was partnership. And you've talked a lot about the importance of partnership in general, but also it being a key component to starting and scaling the work in Evansville. Can you talk a little bit about how you have formed these partnerships and how they've helped you address the blending and braiding strategy?
Yeah, Abe, thanks. And welcome back anytime. I would love to have anyone here in Evansville, Indiana. Lots to share and lots of great things happening in our community. I think I'll go back, Abe. You asked, how do you bring people together in those partnerships? It began by having that diverse stakeholders coming together. And we kind of created what we call the big table. The big table, if you will, is a smorgasbord of agencies all came together with a common goal. And that goal that we kind of established, the original mission statement with that was to establish schools as sites and places of community and to enhance youth and family. So with that, I think, we all had that common goal. As we talked about here, Stephen talked with the blended and braiding. So we understand the definitions of what we're trying to achieve. Oprah just talked about the data that we're trying to get to, those outcomes that are important. But at that big table, it led to a lot of other communities and organizations then kind of networking together, having those conversations so everyone is in the same room at the same time, that common vision. And then, we can kind of direct and then organically, if you will, the conversations just kind of morph into, well, as Oprah said, I'm pretty good at that. I can do this part of the plan. if you could do this, because you're good at this, right? And then together we just continue to put the puzzle together, really leading towards the community schools, the pillars and the community schools moving forward, working together. Those relationships, as we all know, they don't happen overnight. We're not trying to meet someone today and then build them into a grant tomorrow. That trust has to be there. And I think we then leverage those existing networks that are at that big table. And the reason we call it a big table is, those 50 to 60 agencies and organizations literally sit around a big table. And we were able to continue that virtual big table during COVID. And now I've got back to the in-person, but as you will, with the hybrid part as well. So the leveraging of the existing networks that's taking place in our community, the shared resources and services that so many the agencies are already doing, and then just bringing them together. We've talked a lot about the thriving community leads to a thriving school system. We also know that a thriving school system leads to a thriving community. We all want that same thing. We have that common goal, that common vision, working together, providing the smorgasbord of programs that are being offered throughout our community, whether we're leading them as a school district or the other agency, as Dreama kind of mentioned, is taking the lead on that. As long as we're all together, our community is going to thrive.
Terrific. I love the visual of a big table with all those partners coming together. And are you the ones who call those partners to the table? Are you the ones that kind of set the table for folks?
Abe, it started with us. Yeah, I think we were the leader on that. But then what we also offer is they're the owners of this. We just are kind of the conveners. We'll send out the messages. We'll send out the notes. Great representation from EVSC. But then we also ask the other agencies, who's not here and should be here? Who from our community is not here and should be here? What we want to hear the voice of all, and it kind of started, that big table really started from listening to our community, hearing the voice. And I've mentioned this before in different places. They wanted to beautify their boulevard. And so it literally started by planting tulips in a boulevard. And we all know tulips are there, and then they come back every year. That's what our partners continue to do. And so then they bring others with them.
Love that. And so the table gets bigger and bigger, it sounds like, as you continue to sort of uncover what it is you want to get done and where the needs are. I love that. And, you mentioned voice. Something I've heard you talk about in the past is bringing student voice into this work. And so can you say a little bit about how you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, and I know we'll maybe get into this, so it started with our community schools, and we're very fortunate to have 21st Century Community Learning Center coordinators that listen to our students. They'll survey our students, whether it be, traditional survey type thing or just asking word of mouth. And that's probably better for our students. What do you want in your programs at your school? What do you want to see? We know then that the student voice, if they're motivated to be there, to be involved in our out of school time training and programs that we offer, they're likely to have that better attendance. They're likely to have the higher test scores. They're likely to have more of a sense of belonging because they're the ones that started this program. They said they wanted to have it, just as our agencies went and said who should be here. Our students can go and recruit other students and their friends and their peers and say, we have this program, come join it with me as well. So it's their voice, and it's our family's voice as well, as we put together the family engagement events. Yeah, we may put them together similar to the big table, but it's around what they've told us that they want to hear, that they want to learn more about, whether it's our student information center, whether it's attachment to different resources, just giving them the opportunity to express their voice and making sure we're listening, whether we can do it or hear them and say, that's a great idea. Let's work together on that.
Yeah, thank you for centering youth voices and families' voices in this work. That's such an important lesson for folks to learn about. You mentioned the full service community schools work you've been doing, and if I understand correctly, the work you did with full service community schools positioned you to go after a Promise Neighborhood grant. Can you talk about that relationship?
Yeah, And we're very fortunate to have those relationships, which built on top of each other. As I said, the partnerships didn't happen overnight. Our University of Evansville, Purple Aces, proud alumni, really kind of took the lead with us, and then gathered the other partners together, which what we were doing with the full service schools, what we were doing with our 21st Century Community Learning Center sites really built upon and made us ready. Because be honest, we didn't receive our promised neighborhood the first time that we wrote for it. The team came back together, that core team came back together and got better. We didn't receive it a second time either. But eventually we were like, you know what? We have a lot of good things going in our community. How do we then strengthen the existing partnerships that we have and then further increase the capacity? And that's what happened really. And the MOU partners, we have 23 different MOU partners in this Promised Neighborhood grant that came together to do the work that they know how to do to increase our community and leads towards that thriving community that we all want.
Terrific. Well, I'm looking forward to going back to Evansville at some point soon and would love to continue that conversation. But thank you for sharing what you've shared so far.
Yeah. Abe, I'll have this out here. I'd be remiss if I didn't. So next week is the what Evansville calls the Fall Festival, and it's one of the largest street festivals in the nation. What that does, though, there's a nut club group that puts this together. So a lot of food booths. So if you do come next week, don't check your cholesterol the day after or 2 days after. There are some healthy benefits, but they have given over $700,000 back into our community to the nonprofits that are then leading towards that thriving community, leading towards that thriving school system. So look forward to seeing anyone in Evansville next week or anytime after.
All right. Everyone's invited to Evansville next week. Fantastic. Thank you, Kim. All right. Let's get to our last panelist. Last but not least, Ashley Harris is the founder and strategist of Jumping Hoops Consulting. But Ashley, formerly you were with the Georgia Department of Education, and I know you did a lot of work thinking about how to blend and braid funding within the department, but also looking at other streams of data. So really excited to hear you talk about this. As you're thinking about blending and braiding funds to support the whole child as part of a state agency, the Georgia State Department of Education, what did it look like at that level? And as you reflect on that, what were some of the challenges that you encountered? Oh, and you're muted, Ashley. There you go.
I knew that was going to happen. Everything was going so great, and then I had the furies. But thank you again, Ave, and everyone for inviting me to this webinar. I thought long and hard about what all to share, and it's a lot. So first of all, when I think of braiding and blending, I'm an analogy person. So if anyone else is on this call the same way, that someone had to break it down differently to me. So braiding is essentially, think about it as a football program. If someone gave you money as a donation to the football program, that is blended dollars, because they're just saying, hey, here's this check, use it for the football program, period. However, when you think about braiding funds, if someone came to you and handed you a check and earmarked it only for equipment or only for training of staff members or only for these things, they're still separate individual sources of funding, but they can be utilized in order to impact the football program. So when somebody said it like that to me, it was like, oh, okay, now I get it. So I can move forward with it. So just if you remember football, just remember that particular piece of it. And that also aligns if you think about the different federal programs and dollars the same exact way. 2A can be used for training. 4A can be used for the community school coordinator. I saw somebody drop that in one of the questions for the group, or even 4A can be utilized to do some of the services. So when I thought about at the state level, I was first new in the K-12, so it was a lot of asking the question of why. And Stephen asked me this during our prep call of, Ashley, how did you figure this out? And honestly, I just kept asking why, and not why questioning people's authority or questioning their ability to do their jobs or their knowledge stream. It was really just asking the question, why do we do it like that? And who said we had to do it like that? Kind of being a rebel in the system and really just constantly asking that question. It always came down to people would say it was either a policy or a practice? And most of the time people will end up telling me, oh, it's policy. And I'm like, okay, let's go find that policy. But oftentimes we would never find a policy. So it was like, okay, this is a practice. Now, how do we undo this practice, or can we do something differently? Or will we botch one part of the system because we're doing this new change? So it was a lot of different questions and exploration in order to even get there. But that was one of the big things. I think as states, what they can do in order to help local organizations and local school districts do this work is really being able to educate what flexibility even looks like and what it means. A lot of people are still stuck in the thought process on, if I spend this money the wrong way, I'm gonna look good. I'm gonna have to look good in orange every day. If you like me, I love the color orange, but not every day. So it's one of those things of help them understand what they can do with the money. Like, tell them. And if you can't tell them, show them examples, give them opportunities to convene together to talk about how someone else has been able to use the money. Create quick guides. And I'm not talking about those long guides that's 900 pages long that you needed an appendix to understand the appendix. I'm talking about like a quick document. How do you put this information together to give it to people for them to utilize it? There's going to be a link that's dropped in the chat about I called it federal programs shorthand. It was something really quick to put together, but really just to help people understand, hey, here are all these federal programs. These are all the purposes of those federal programs. So how can you actually utilize that money in order to do what you need to get done? So I think that that's one big way, is education and being able to provide examples. Also help districts understand how to write their narrative and utilize their data. States collect an enormous amount of data, and half of the data is never even used. So it's one of those things of identify, one, what data do we need to stop collecting? Two, what data do we need to utilize further? And three, what type of data do we need to visualize so that districts and sites can actually use it? It's one thing to have the data. It's a whole nother thing to expect someone in a small school district in a rural community to have someone that be able to analyze all that data and then being able to understand what it means. So the state can take that on. Also, the state can look across trends. If there are specific types of funding that is being used across the entire state, then maybe that's something that the state needs to address instead of leaving it to the individual district. This is also when it comes into that cross-sector pollination, so to speak, or that sharing. I know here in the state of Georgia, we kept seeing a disconnect between education and mental health. So why not just go work with the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities to try to co-sponsor a position? So we did create a liaison role that sits between both of those state agencies now. But again, these are things that states can be doing. I'm looking through my notes really fast. Oh, narrative and data. Also making sure that districts know how to write their narrative. Someone also talked about grant writing on here. It's really easy to tell people, hey, we have this grant that's available for this. But again, if I'm in a school district that we already are short-staffed, we don't have anybody that's a staff grant writer, and we don't have a local community organization that can write it for us, how are we going to write that grant? So states can also develop training for individuals to become grant writers. Grant Writers USA's. There's so many organizations out there that are providing grant writing language to be able to help schools and districts. But the main thing is to think about this collective care and collective impact. And when I say care, I mean, who all is invested in this particular thing that we're trying to do, whether it's we are trying to change the trajectory of mental health. We're trying to make sure every child has viable health care, whatever the thing may be. But identify all the people that are invested in that thing, and then think collectively, how can we impact this thing and change it into what we want it to be, instead of it being an individual one-off thing. Instead of having 17 wheels, just make one big wheel, like Kim said, and just have a big table instead of breaking it up in so many different ways.
Wow. Wow. You put a lot on the table there. Thank you, Ashley. And I'm already thinking about like an infographic that looks like a football field or something, you know, around sustainability. We'll figure it out. But I think there's something there with like a big table on it. We'll figure it out. So yeah, lots there. And I wanna highlight one point in particular you made around, you know, asking the question why, and, you know, really making sure we know what the policy is. And sometimes it's the interpretation of the policy that's the barrier, and we can always revisit that, right? So thank you for lifting that up. You started talking about this, but maybe you can say a little bit more about just, you know, you were at the Department of Education. How were you able to get other state agencies to be a part of this work? So how did you work across different agencies across the state?
Showed up at everybody's door and just asked them, could we have a conversation? Because I just wanted to learn what they did. I didn't show up asking for anything because nobody likes that. Nobody wants to just be said, hey, how you doing? Can I have X? No, nobody likes that in our personal life or our professional life. So I showed up just generally asking, what is it that you all do and how do you interact with kids? How do you support families? Just opened the door to ask those questions. Once people started telling me what they did and what they were going through, I already knew what my mission was and what my tasks were from my state agency. So it became a, hey, have you ever thought about connecting in this way? Or, hey, I would love to connect you with this person. So I literally just started building bridges between all these different people because I was meeting with everyone. So I would say, hey, you need to go talk to the Carter Center, or hey, you need to go talk to Georgia Appleseed, or you need to go talk to Voices. So literally just becoming a connector of all things so that when people started thinking, I wonder if X is going on, I became kind of that person that people will reach out to, like, hey, Ashley, do you know such and such? Even in my personal life, I thrive in being able to connect people and things. So when it comes to this, it's really just making sure that you're one, asking the questions around what do people do? Because again, I think it gets back to the same thing. We may think we know, but do we really? So asking that question of what is it that they have going on? What is it that their agency is positioned to do? It was not even known here. If you were to sit down and ask all these different people, what is mental health? If there are 6 of us that I can see, including our wonderful Angela here, doing our ASL, if we were to ask all 6 of us, what does mental health mean? And all of us came back with a different definition, then are we really all working on the same thing? So really getting that collective understanding of what we were saying, and then secondarily being able to bring everyone into the fold and asking them what they were doing so that you could connect the partners in and of the work.
Thank you for that. So one last question here. In our last conversation, you mentioned you gave the observation that sometimes people at the state or local level are afraid to think about flexibility when it comes to funding. How do folks get beyond that fear? What have you found that seems to work to get people to just think more creatively? I know we want to avoid the orange jumpsuits, but I think there, as you said, there is opportunity for some flexibility, but that fear can be an obstacle. How do you get past that fear?
One, I'm gonna tell you to take a real big breath and put on your big girl underwear. That's something that my grandparents would say to me. Is really there is no. I think the thing that I always hear people say is that your best self is on the other side of a challenge. So I kind of like, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You have to go through whatever that discomfort is, but knowing that you can do it in community with people that actually have the same goal as you to be able to do whatever it is you have stated for kids, or being able to do this for families or uplift your community. I think that that collective piece of it allows everyone to kind of put down their fear because they aren't standing there doing it alone. They are able to do it with others. But if there are individuals that are on this webinar or out there, period, because there's lots and lots of people that are doing it on their own, that still doesn't mean that you need others in order to do it. You still just have to put in front of you, how is this going to impact the community? How is this going to impact the kids? How is this going to impact families? Because regardless if you are directly involved in those communities, helping those kids or a part of those families, they are interacting with you in some form or fashion. So us being in this collective care thought process and capacity at all times really does help us reduce that amount of fear that we have internally, and ultimately just trust yourself. You've gotten through 100% of every hard thing you've ever faced in your life. So just keep trying to get to the other side of every other hard thing.
Well, I can't think of a better way to close out this panel conversation. I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we don't. I hope everyone will join me in thanking Dreama, Oprah, Kim, Ashley for your time and wisdom today. Thank you for your leadership and generosity. And with that, I'll hand it back to Stephen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abe, and all of our panelists. What a great discussion. It's hard to cut it off since we only have an hour. I feel like there's a lot of follow-up questions we've been getting. I appreciate we've got almost 450 people who've joined in today. I mentioned in the chat, I'll be sharing the speaker contact information. They were graciously allowing folks to be able to reach out with questions after this webinar. So you'll get that. And so just really, really excited for the conversations that are going to be following up after this webinar as well. And I'm really excited now to keep this conversation going with somebody who's been a real thought leader on this topic of blending and braiding at the Department of Education. I'm going to turn it over to somebody I've learned a lot from and who has immense expertise in providing cradle to career supports at the School Superintendents Association, the Office of Head Start, and now at the U.S. Department of Education, Deputy Assistant Secretary Bernadine Futrell.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Stephen. Hi, everybody. What a wonderful showing, and we are very excited to see so many of you online. I am incredibly grateful and honored that we have kicked off this webinar series, and we have more to come as this is a series, and Stephen will talk about that. But I do want to just pause and say thank you to the speakers for really showing almost under the hood how they've been able to navigate the different sources of funding, partnerships to really do what I love. Ashley made the point before she closed, how to do what's family and child centered. That's the bottom line. How do we take everything that we have, our resources, our partnerships, our MOUs, all those things, and put our children in the center, our students, their communities in the center to make improvements across the board. So I'm incredibly thankful for the great and robust conversations that we were able to listen to. And also thank you very much to Jessica and the White House. We thank you for your support and amplifying and partnering and helping to even co-create some great resources around blending and braiding, and even just we've been working on a lot of just very clear guidance on how funds can be used to do what we know is family, child, and centered and effective. I am here as the Deputy Assistant Secretary at U.S. Department of Education, but I come to this conversation from an early experience that I had in my career working at a youth emergency shelter. And one of the things that we had to do in that role is identify when our students, our children came to us, is how to move them from the situations they were in, be it, and a lot of times it was not their fault. Parents were arrested, truancy, different things were happening, but they were coming to our shelter. And our job was to get them to stability. And the process to get our students to stability meant reconnecting them to education, reconnecting them to appropriate transportation, to get all the support services that they needed in order to really fully access and have a wonderful educational experience that we want for every child. And that was like navigating a massive mountain of policies, procedures. Someone mentioned the orange jumpsuit, trying to just figure out how do we do what's best for the children, the students in front of us. And because of that, we are now, I am so proud that we, as this administration, have been advancing school-based services, advancing ways to talk about how to blend and braid and mix funding, and really to be very plain in our language on how you can use funds, because we have an influx of new money, but we also have older policies that are connected. And so I'm encouraged by the participation of those of you on this webinar, because that also helps us hear from you and glean. And so we're very excited that we've been working hard. This webinar is one example of the more work to be done, because there is a lot that we want to be able to get done, and we should and we will be able to do. But I'm also very pleased to also amplify the announcement that a few weeks ago, we did make a new award around for $46 million for what we're calling our content technical assistance centers. And these centers are a part of what many of you are very familiar with, our national and regional centers. But these centers are more specifically aligned with kind of helping to get underneath some of these questions and even some of these strategies that our great panelists talked about. They talked about how they're using Promise, how they might be using Title II, how they might be pursuing a full service grant or magnet grant or any of our discretionary grants, or using the formula funds. And what we want to do, and what we've been very clear about doing, in addition to amplifying the increase of funding, making sure that we are available, but really creating this technical assistance opportunity. And so one of the centers that I'm very pleased and very excited and want all of you to engage with will be our fiscal equity TA center that will provide guidance for states, for districts, for anyone who comes to that center on how to blend and braid local, federal, and state funds to make sure that if you come with a strategy on how you want to better serve students, we want to be able to help answer those questions for you and support you. So we're very excited about that. So please be on the lookout for more information to come. We just announced it the end of September. Very excited. Again, it's the National Technical Assistance Center on Fiscal Equity that's going to help navigate blending and braiding, as well as supporting districts and states on doing more of what you started to do as a result of the American Rescue Plan Fund that you know is working, is effective, is family and child centered. So we want to get along beside you and help navigate how to do that. With that, again, I want to welcome you to the first and invite you to come back to the additional series. And thank you for your partnership. And to kind of close us out and share more about this webinar series, please welcome back and thank you for your leadership here. And welcome back, Stephen. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bernadine, and you set us up so well, I think, to be able to think about these next webinars that we'll be hosting. Thank you all for tuning in. As I mentioned at the start of today's event, this is the first in a series of webinars, and we look forward to seeing you and experts from the Fiscal Equity Center that Bernadine mentioned. We're going to have people who will be talking about blending and braiding at those different levels, focusing in on different specific topics. You can see two of them on your screen. Our next webinar will be at the end of October, on October 30th. And then we'll have monthly webinars after that, November, and then also in December and January, we'll be talking with both philanthropic leaders and nonprofit leaders as well. And while we didn't have time for Q&A today, I really appreciated how active everybody was in the chat. So we'll take those questions we didn't get answered. We'll try to work them into future sessions, and really appreciate you all sharing your own examples and resources for blending and braiding funds. See you next time. Thanks again.